Hello everyone, welcome back to Rolling Solo. My name is Adam Smith. We're going to be going through the rules overview for Fallout the board game. I've been really looking forward to playing this. The first thing I want to announce off the top is we are going to be playing as the Ghoul character from Fallout. So this was the one that received the most votes, and I'm actually really excited for this because out of the 5, this is by far, I think, one of the most unique characters of the 5 from the core game. So this is going to be really cool. We're going to grab the Ghoul and we're going to be placing him near his player board. Of course, the Ghoul will be coming into play inside of the Crossroads camp tile here. Now, again, I did ask for some suggestions as to where the Ghoul should land when it starts. And I heard some things say kind of this way, over here. This is difficult terrain, by the way, this red bordered terrain. But we'll probably start it in the Crossroads camp area, but I've also been debating putting him on the edge here. And the reason being is that I really want to be able to start exploring right out of the gate. So if I put him on this side, you'll notice that both of these tiles touch this edge. So this is a little bit more of a strategic advantage for me because I can choose which of the two paths I want to go when I start. Not that it matters too much because really you can only... I mean, yes, you can actually technically go ahead and explore on either of these, which could be an advantage for us, but the downside is the more you explore, the more enemies you potentially will encounter or have to reveal. So there's that side of it too. Now again, this is the rules overview, but it's not going to go into the nitty-gritty rules. We're going to talk about those as it flows as we play through the game, because otherwise I'm going to lose you in the process for those of you who haven't played before. For those of you who have played before, then a lot of this stuff is going to be pretty common knowledge already. But essentially what we're going to do is, because we are the Ghouls, we're going to take the Ghoul card. We're not going to really need to even reference these 4 guys in the back anymore, but I'll leave them there just for looks. But essentially we do get a character card that specifies we are playing as the Ghoul character, which is really cool. And the Ghoul character, if I can get this to focus, says the survivor identity during setup become vilified. Place this card. So let's actually do that before we go ahead and do anything further. So vilified would be coming over here to your different type of tokens and actually taking this particular one, which is the well-rested token, and flipping it to the opposite side, and you'll see there's a vilified kind of symbol there. That's what we're going to have, and we're going to have as a character trait. It's going to sit in our kind of Pip-Boy right here. So that's pretty cool. And again, I guess it's good, but we are bad. So what's going to end up happening is being vilified essentially means that if we have anything that calls for us being on the evil side of things in terms of quest cards that are going to come from this massive deck, or encounter cards, settlement cards, and all that good stuff, we're going to have to go down that path, or be forced to go down that path, or recognized as that type of a hero or character. So that's pretty cool. We're kind of on the evil side of things this time. In terms of the rest of the card, it says place this card in play, and it does not count against your inventory limit and cannot be traded or discarded. Your maximum HP, or your HP maximum, is 12. When you would suffer rads, recover that amount of HP instead. So being a Ghoul, it's actually advantageous for me to go try to find different locations on this map that actually have a green kind of indication around the particular area. Now, none of those are out right now because we haven't explored enough to find them. But when we do, my character can actually move into, let's say this one was all green highlighted, I could move into it, and when I'm supposed to normally take damage for rads, which again would be moving this rad marker here, which is green, and hopefully you can see the symbol right there, move that down the line. Instead of taking the rad damage, I'd actually be increasing my health, but there is a downside to this in that my maximum HP is 12, so I have to remember to keep my my marker at 12, because typically you would start at 16 HP, but with being the Ghoul, I'm going to start at 12. You're going to notice much closer to hitting on the rad side of things. So, but at the same time, what it's making up for is by not, probably by not having the rads be as effective or as much of a detriment to me, we're losing a little bit of health in exchange. So there's that. And again, it's not just temporary, it's I can never go above 12 HP. So something to keep in mind. So again, we'll keep this close to our character, technically maybe down to the side here. One of the things I want to mention here is on the far right side, you'll see this little icon here. This is for influence. The major purpose behind this entire game for a solo player is to gain 11 influence. Now you're going to gain 1 influence right when you start the game because you need to pull an agenda card. When you do that, you're already up 1. That's probably why they started at 11. Then you need to gain 10 more influence throughout the world of Fallout. by doing quests, completing quests, going through encounters, fighting monsters, all that kind of stuff. All of it's going to lead into hopefully obtaining enough influence to basically win the game. If you get to 11, you can declare that you have the 11 influence, and then you win. That's how you win. That's the winning condition. The losing conditions are a little bit more interesting. Essentially, if one of the factions of which you're playing against or with, depending on how you base your loyalty, if one of these two different symbols, which essentially correlate to the different type of factions, and again are totally different per scenario, happen to rip down the chart all the way to the very last one, or exceed it, regardless whether it lands or exceeds it, then that faction automatically wins and you lose the game. So there is a timer built into the game, and you do have to be wary of that. One of the things to take note of is that one of the main counters in the game for yourself as a solo player is you're going to be flipping the agenda deck here, and you're doing this typically even when you're playing with other players, but I'm just going to try to keep it specific to solo play. But essentially in solo play, you're going to go ahead and you're going to be flipping these agenda cards after every single time you take an activation. So after every round per se that you're done, so once I'm done with my turn here with the Ghoul, he gets 2 specific actions, which we'll talk about what are some of the things he can do. But essentially when his activation is done, we'll flip an agenda card, and when we flip that agenda card, and we can actually flip this one because this is going to be, I'm going to go ahead and flip this one essentially because this is going to be my starting agenda card, because every single character when you start a game gets an agenda card to start. So this is a good example because I can not only use this to show you what is going to be actually on me to start, because everyone gets one, but also kind of how the agenda card activations work a little bit. So one of the things I want to make mention of is the fact that this particular card again shows that you get 1 influence. So anytime you see this big thumbs up right here on the card, it means you got an influence. So that's going to be great. You're going to put it right in that area where it matches up with the icon just to show it. You can put it underneath, beside it, however you want. And then you'll also notice that there's some text on it. It says for each space that the shield icon has advanced further than the star icon. So in that case, the Institute has advanced further than the railroads. In other words, if this is moved like this and this one's here, that would gain me 2 influence essentially. So what I'd be doing by going ahead, it says here at the start of your turn, you may reveal this card to declare loyalty to the shield. So essentially what you're saying is you want to be friends with the individuals of the Institute. If you do that, they are no longer going to be your focus of attack on the map. So that means any faction symbols that match that, which in this case would be a shield, are not going to come after you to try to attack you. They're going to be friendly towards you. So that's an advantage. We'll talk a little bit about that in a few seconds, about some other advantages to gaining loyalty there. But the major one is the fact that the faction won't come after you. The other bonuses, like this card mentions, is that if I can keep this face up, and you can choose even on your turn to flip it over at any point in time and change your loyalty on the fly. But if you want to keep this up, you're gaining +1 influence every single time this shield happens to get further away from the star. Now, the way the solo play works, and I'm going to leave this here because this is essentially mine, but I haven't revealed it yet because we haven't started playing, so I'll leave it kind of face down. Maybe I'll put it back where it should belong. But essentially what will happen between these two guys right here is these ones will move in solo play depending on whether or not if an encounter happens to resolve. So in other words, one of these quest cards over here happen to have a symbol that has a star or a shield, and there's a plus symbol after it. If the plus symbol's there, if there's only one of them, then that means that that particular faction is referring to with that symbol moves down 1. If there's 2 plus symbols, it moves 2, that type of thing. The other way that these can actually move essentially is when the agenda deck depletes. So the agenda deck will be burned through, as I talked about earlier. Every single time a round goes through, you're flipping a card and you're going to look at the bottom of it. So let's say hypothetically that this was the first card. Let's say this card is sitting here, although we already looked at it, but let's just say it was sitting here for purposes of an example. I flip this over at the end of my first turn, take a look at the bottom, and that's the only thing I care about in the bottom right. And it says, as you can see, there's a bug there. So again, I'm not sure the exact terminology for the icon, but essentially what that means is all monsters on the map that have that particular icon are going to activate. So that's very interesting. Now, what that's going to mean essentially is if you take a look at the game board, as of right now, I actually don't have any monsters on the board, but in just a few seconds, you're going to see that change. So in preparation for the actual game itself, you're going to go ahead and take a look at every single tile that's actually face up at the start, and you're going to just notice that there are some symbols on those particular cards that correlate to one of those 5 different categories of enemies. So essentially you're going to go ahead and grab a token, and for every space that you see an icon like this, you're going to put the matching token there. However, it's going to be face up. That's the fun part. I don't know what this is yet, so let's find out what we've got. We've got ourselves Mr. Gutsy. So Mr. Gutsy is going to be here at a level 2 and looks like he has range, so he'll be able to attack us from distance or an adjacent space. But regardless, he's going to start here. Down here is the other spot where one of those tokens happens to be placed. And again, this is all done during setup as well. So before you start your first turn. And we flip this over, we got a Super Mutant Skirmisher. That's nasty. So he's at level 3. He gives you some loot, and he's also ranged. He's a pretty heavy-duty guy, and good thing he's as far down here as downtown Boston, because I don't want to see him right now. We got nothing going on in Diamond City area, and of course nothing going on up here in the Crossroads area, so everything else is clear. But essentially you've got your enemies here, and the reason that the enemies, they obviously put some enemies on the board to start, as I was talking about in terms of the agenda card. When that agenda card is first flipped, if you take a look at that agenda card and the activation symbol happens to match any of the enemies on the board, if they're face up, they're going to activate as if they're trying to get closer to you and attack you, or they're just going to try to attack you from range, whatever they need to do. We'll get into more specifics on all of that when it actually happens in real time, but as of this one right here, there were no bug tokens actually currently on the board, so those types of monsters actually wouldn't activate. So in other words, you kind of be wiping your brow going, woo, thank goodness I don't have to do anything there. I kind of got a free pass on that particular round. But normally, it's going to probably land on something that says, you know, go ahead and activate all monsters with this particular symbol right here. This little kind of time stamp kind of thing going on over there. So if that happens to be on the agenda card, you're going to have to activate the monster. If he's this far away from where you are way up there, he's just going to move to whichever space gives him the most advantageous route to you. So it would likely be here. And the reason it'd be here is because there's a divided line there, and that would give him ability to kind of spread out and go whichever way he needs to. But again, there's no, there's argument to go here as well. But at certain points, essentially, his goal is going to be coming after you, really. When they finally reach here, if he happens to pull an agenda card and his symbol comes up again, then it's going to start moving a lot quicker. He's going to start hitting these major tiles, and he's moving one at a time. So in other words, he's only going to move slow in the areas that are revealed, but once he starts getting to these unrevealed areas, he is going to start picking up steam quick, and he's going to start chasing you down. So you're going to want to get ready for him. So the advantage of actually seeing who starts at least is good, but going forward, the fun part with the monsters is that they're not always active. They're not always considered active. And active is face up, where you can actually see them like this. Inactive is when they're face down. So for instance, if this monster happened to, in some crazy situation, which would never occur, all the way up here, and I killed it, which would never happen, if it was gone off the map, what would happen is you have to automatically spawn another of that same type of monster on the nearest icon to my character. So if I hadn't revealed anything else, it would be spawning back down here. Now you'd think, oh, wouldn't it spawn face up active? No, it actually spawns face down inactive when it comes back in for the second time. And the only way that that will flip back up is if another agenda card comes out with its symbol, then it will activate. So this basically, I think the reason they did it this way is so that if you happen to be in the space when you kill it, then when it respawns, if this was the only spot with the icon and you put it back in your space, it's inactive. It wouldn't actually come after you right away. Whereas if it came in as a reinforcement essentially on that same turn, it would be, and it was active, well, you'd just be in a non-stop battle that would just never end, essentially. So that's kind of just a little explanation in terms of how the monsters are refreshed. And again, we'll talk much more about that when it actually happens in real time. There is a couple things about my character that I don't want to skip over, so let's just take a couple steps back and talk a little bit more about our Ghoul character. Before our board is actually officially done, we have correctly put this at 12. We do have the vilified character trait up here, but the last thing that we haven't done yet is gone ahead and gotten our corresponding special tokens. So these are really cool. And the very first one that we get for being a Ghoul, because every single character you select will have one that actually matches, the back will match the actual character you selected, so in this case the Ghoul, and it'll correspond to a certain letter all the time. In my case, it's P, which is perception. So this is going to sit right here, and it's going to be activated right from the beginning, which means if I happen to get any items or weapons that are going to aid me or potentially have a P inside of the card, I might be able to get some extra rerolls, which would be nice. The other thing that happens when you start a new character is you don't just get the one that is guaranteed and always the same. You do actually get to pick one more from the pile over there, and you get to add that in too. So I'm going to go ahead and grab one, flip it over, and I happen to get a P. Now, this is actually a great example because if this ever happens, it's not legally allowed to happen on the very first character build, essentially, at the very beginning. If this was to happen in a character level up later on in the game, and you chose out of two, which is a whole different story. Essentially, when you level up, you pick two of them and choose one. If I was to happen to take two and pick this one, and it matches the one I already have, then you'd actually be picking up a perk instead. But we'll talk about that when we level up. Totally different situation. But on the very first one, you can't have the same letter as what you started with. So this has got to go back, and we'll pick a different one. And I got an I, so that's what we're going to be starting with, is a P and an I. I's for intelligence, and each one of them correspond to different words and stuff like that, and they'll come into play as we need them. The only other thing I want to talk about is, let me think here, is there anything else? I think at least for the Ghoul anyway, that's good. Leveling up, how leveling up works essentially is after you kill a monster, so let's say hypothetically we get into a battle, again fighting I'll talk about when we actually are playing through it in real time, but let's say hypothetically we killed Mr. Gutsy here, we go ahead and we gain the XP based on its level, so in this case it would be 2. So essentially you come over here and you see the XP track right here starts kind of off center from the rest of the special numbers. What you'd be doing is just essentially moving along the track from that position, and you'd be moving until you hit a letter. So 1, that's 1 XP, 2, this is 2 XP, and then you put your peg here. Now, as you can see, it might look a little confusing. Why are you kind of going across the letters? Well, essentially that's the game's way of allowing you to level up your character. And of course, it starts very quick at the beginning because you don't have that many letters. So for a couple XP, you're going to be leveling up very fast because you're going to be skipping across letters and there's not many of them. But as you level up, you're going to get a new letter in here, and then it's going to slow the leveling progression right down to a crawl, especially when you get up to that like 6th letter. So as of right now, if I was to get 2 XP, I don't get to level up. I just am moving across the track, stopping and counting at each letter. So I got 2 XP, I stop there. If I hypothetically had gotten 3 XP, I'd be moving this peg to the next letter, but there is none in the track. You go right back to the start, and as soon as your peg goes into the start, then you automatically level up. So at this point now, I would actually be leveling up. And I would go ahead and when you actually level up, you get to go ahead and, like I mentioned earlier, you get to take 2 of these particular ones and you'd flip them over and you get to choose one. If you happen to choose one of the 2 that match the same letter that you already have in here, then you can go ahead and take a perk card, which is kind of like a one-time use card. So I'll show you an example of one of them. So for instance, you might you might decide to go the perk route and pick a letter that you already have. Well, in this case, you would have got the Grim Reaper Sprint, and it says discard the card, and these are always one-time use. Discard the card, or discard to become death itself until the end of your turn. Perform 1 additional action after each fight in which you kill an enemy. So again, very powerful, very cool, but they don't last forever. They're just quick hit type things. But there's a number of them, and I actually haven't seen many of them just yet. I've only had a few come up through playthroughs off camera, but we'll talk more about those as we go along. So that's pretty good in terms of the level up. We'll talk more about the leveling up when we actually do it in game as well. We've already covered this situation. Again, one thing to note is, of course, these are actually the enemies. So whenever you see a token like this, like we were talking about the factions, of course, it corresponds to the Institute. If I happen to run into this shield on the actual board, it corresponds to this particular character, the Synth. So that's who I'd be actually going after. And you'll see here there's certain letters here sometimes. It'll say Y or it might say X. And they correspond to the track. So if you can see this right along the side here, if it happens to be in the green, X is worth 1, Y is worth ranged. If these tokens happen to move down into this area, well then X is 2 and Y is ranged. This stuff may sound like weird math equations, but it really essentially allows for a really unique way to increase the power and change up the enemies per scenario depending on which card you've got here. So we'll talk more about that when we get into it. In terms of fighting, of course, we talked about this before, maybe, I'm not too sure. But in terms of rolling dice, if I was going to go ahead and make an attack, when you roll your dice, if you happen to have no rerolls in the dice and you're just rolling them just to see if you've made hits, essentially the enemy's always going to hit you first, and then you're going to go ahead and see how many hits you made against it. So for instance, if we were attacking the super mutant here and we needed arms and we needed a head, we need to be landing 3 hits in order to kill it, but the fun part is I only got 1 hit. Now, before I talk about mine, I have to talk about the damage coming to me first. So in this case, the super mutant would be hitting me for 1, 2, 3. Now, you'd think it would just be 1, 2, 3, and that's what you put on your HP track, but it's not. It's actually for every one of these little pips on the die, you're going to take that 1 and times it by 3. So really, at the end of the day, you can times the number of pips by the level, which is 3 times 3, and just with some basic math, that's 9 HP. And then all of a sudden you realize how absolutely painful these guys can actually be, and that's going to drop you, from 12 down to 3. And this is why you're not going to be ready to fight something like that right off the hop. But then when you go ahead and actually calculate how many hits you have against it, it's kind of brutal, but you essentially need to land the number of hits of its level and in one shot. So in other words, you do not get to put damage tokens. This is an Imperial Assault. You don't get to kind of whittle away at the enemy. It's a do or die type situation. If you don't do it, he's there and he's still at full health for the next turn. So it can be punishing. So it just proves that you need to be ready before you take on or run into these types of vicious monsters. But it makes the game fun that way. So that's a little bit about the monsters. In terms of the solo aspects of the game, again, we're going to have the agenda deck here, which we're going to be flipping through. It's going to be it really ends up being kind of like the way to determine how the AI works in the game. That's really what the agenda deck is for the most part, at least in the solo game. And as well, now what I'll do here is I'm going to grab the Learn to Play book, because there is a couple entries in here that are really specific to solo play that I really want to make mention of and make sure that we don't forget. So the first thing is, and this might actually be worthwhile to just go over quickly, because some of these are straightforward, but some of them are nice to know. So it says right here, when playing Fallout in solo mode, follow all the standard rules for the game with the following exceptions. So when a quest requires you to be in a space with another survivor, you must be in a settlement space instead. So that symbol right there is settlement, and if you want to know more about those, this card right here, or deck, is a settlement deck. So this is the one it would be referring to, and then if you're wondering where that is on the map, it would be anything that has an icon like a settlement icon. So a Diamond City, for instance, would be considered a settlement. And then over here it says, when resolving encounter cards, let's see if we can just unblurred here. When resolving encounter cards, read them yourself. And this one's pretty straightforward. So obviously, normally you'd have your friend beside you read the encounter, and then you'd go ahead and tell him which response you'd like to take. When you're playing solo, you have to read the encounters, which I'm going to do. I'm going to read them to you guys, but I'm not going to show you the card, because if I show you the card, you'll see the actual answers on it. And then I'm going to make a choice, and then every once in a while, maybe I'll leave the choice up to you guys to make as well. And then the last thing here says, when the agenda deck is depleted, advance only the power token for the faction that currently has less power. If factions are tired, they both advance as normal. So what it's saying there essentially is when you're playing with multiple people and the agenda deck depletes, which is the deck we've already talked about, this one right here, once you go through it, every single round activation, flip it over, do its AI activations. When you get to the end of this AI deck, essentially, or agenda deck, when it's depleted, you're going to come over here, and if these two faction tokens happen to be in the same spot, they're going to shift down like this. That would happen normally in the multiplayer version as well as solo. However, if they sit like this, or they're actually not at the exact same level, then the one that's behind it is going to move forward. So what that's going to constantly do is, as you remember from my agenda card that I pulled, this one really has something that says if I choose loyalty to the Institute, which is a shield, then I can get extra influence for each one. Well, guess what? The agenda deck's going to be kind of trying to prevent this in solo play by always moving the faction with the least power forward one. So yes, I might be able to get this thing all the way down to here, but slowly the agenda deck's going to start trying to whittle its way back, which is going to slow my progression in pulling in influence through that particular agenda card. So what I'm going to have to do is start relying on a lot of questing, which will be interesting to see how that pans out. And hopefully it pans out good. So I think that's the majority of stuff. The other thing to make mention of is this stuff up here. So you got a bunch of these trackers as quests come out, quest cards, of course. If you get a quest card, we should actually have one out already, and you'll notice the whole setup is a little different than where I did my solo setup because I had to move things around. But we should have started with Welcome to the Commonwealth, which is number 14. So it's from this deck here, and we should actually probably pull it out so we have it just as a reference. But essentially, this is our very first one, very first card. You guys saw this in the last video. But basically, if we wanted, it says here, there's Diamond City, for instance, and stuff like that. If there's a particular, once you get a multiple quests staged in this area, then you're going to want to start tracking them. So you can go ahead and put like a one color. You could say, all right, I'm going to put a yellow one here, so that I know that this quest correlates to the yellow tracker, and then take the second yellow tracker and put it in Diamond City. So now you have a visual reference of like, oh yeah, that actual quest is taking me there. And then when you're done resolving it, you can just clear it. So that's really what those things are for, is just a method of tracking quests, because once you get more than one, things can get a little crazy. Again, all of the tokens for the different factions, you're going to see more of them come into the game. So more shields, more stars are going to come in, which is more of the Railroad and the Institute, just jumping around the Commonwealth and stuff like that. Again, loot. The shop typically always has 4 entries. When you actually have a shop action, which you can do shop actions when you go into settlements, then you're going to go ahead and pull an extra shop card out, which is going to be kind of like a nice surprise when you get there, and then see what happens, essentially. Every time you visit a settlement, you don't just get to go shopping every single time. You have to actually do an encounter there. So you go into the settlement, essentially pull this card. If it tells you that you can shop in the end, then you can shop. This one I'm drawing a blank on off the top of my head. I can't remember what the symbol is for, but it's whatever the other symbol is for. Essentially, this one is like a downtown. It's more of a city area. So essentially, if you landed in downtown Boston, you'd be pulling from this deck. And stuff like that. So there's interesting mechanics that have to do with these two decks in terms of quest cards as well. So certain quest cards will say that you're supposed to add them in. So when you finish a quest here, there's a bunch of terminology. If you see keywords like add or staged, then you have 2 different things that you have to do. So if you see something called staged, it needs to be put down here in the staging area. So this, for instance, the Welcome to the Commonwealth is staged. And you can see even if we do certain things here, they're going to stage the cards in this area. If it says add, it means put it into the top of either of the 2 decks, depending on where it tells you to add it. And you're going to, interestingly enough, it'll say something like add to settlement deck. Well, you take the number of players that are currently playing. So in my case, 1 person. You take that card off the top. You take the card that actually told you to add it in, and you put it on top face down. You shuffle them so you don't know which one's which, and you put it on top. So in other words, the story progression is going to be linked. You'll see it eventually. You just don't know when. So the game's not just going to go completely linear. It's going to throw in a couple side things every once in a while. Keeps a surprise kind of coming at you. And I can tell you that implementation works a heck of a lot better in solo play than it does in multiplayer. I've heard multiple people say that is there's a little bit of a dysfunction there, because if you think about playing that with multiplayer, you'd be grabbing 1 of these cards for every player at the table. So if you had 4 people at the table, you'd grab 4 of these cards, plus adding in the new quest that you just found, putting it in, shuffling it. The chances of you finding that is 5 cards deep. So you may not even be the one that ends up finding it, and there was that disconnect people were complaining about. Hopefully they'll fix that maybe in the future. But for solo play, it works perfectly because nobody else is going to get there except for you, because you're the only one playing, and that's great. Woohoo, solo players. Okay, so now that's pretty much it for the most part. And of course, you got Nuka-Cola caps. Of course, the blues are 5. Reds are 1. You're going to use those to purchase items in the store. You can see up in the top left right-hand corner that you've got cap values. So 6, 5, 4, those are the cap values. Of course, you got an eye over here for the Protectron. And interestingly enough, if we actually go to shop, we actually have that eye. And if you have that particular special, then you are able to actually go ahead and purchase that. It doesn't cost any money, you just gain it. So that's pretty awesome. So we might want to go after that thing, because that thing can actually protect us. And hey, protection's always good. So that's something to keep in mind for our character. Again, if we happen to be doing a shop action, we'd be getting an additional card. So there might be something that's better. Who knows? That'll be the fun part of taking a look. I think that's pretty much it. I think that covers the majority of it before we get into the mechanics of actually moving around the map and taking actions and things like that. So the only other thing I'll show you guys, for those of you who don't have the game, is I'm going to show you the actions list just so you can get a general sense of the different things that you can essentially do. There goes my phone. Hopefully it didn't shatter into 50 pieces. So right here, resolving a turn, there's a section here for essentially what you can do on your turn. It says when it's your turn, it's your time to shine. You get 2 essential actions that you can use, and you're allowed to break them up. So you can break it up like, you know, if you take movement, for example, it says move your figure around the map, and over here the move action explains you can take up to 2 movements. You can move 2 however you want. You can even move 1, do, you know, an encounter or a fight, and then move again. So you can break up your actions, which is nice. Exploring reveals an adjacent face-down map tile. So simply right here where I currently would start if I chose to, I could choose to reveal either one of these for 1 action. Again, I get 2 every turn. I could choose to complete one of the available quests. Now, this is an interesting one. So there's an action called questing, and every single time on a card that you see a symbol that kind of looks like a stamp. So this would be a good example of it. If we were to try to do Welcome to the Commonwealth and we wanted to finish this one, you'll see there's a stamp symbol beside Diamond City. We actually have to spend when we're in Diamond City, of course, we'd have to spend a quest action to actually complete this quest. So that's all this one says to do. The other one here up top says to kill any, essentially the skull symbol, which means kill any of these guys when you can find them. There's currently none on the map. This other one's easier, just says head to Diamond City, essentially. And if you go to Diamond City and use an action to do a quest, then you can go ahead and actually complete that quest. So that one's pretty straightforward, but that one's not as exciting of an action, except for when you're ready to, and you're only going to use that really when you're ready to complete a quest. Encounter is the draw and resolve an encounter card according to the position on the map. So again, this goes back to these 2 decks. Where are you? Are you in a settlement? And this is a good time for me to do a quick flip and find out what that other one is called. It's a Wasteland encounter. So this one's called a Wasteland encounter. So you're pulling from these decks. Again, this is how story progression can come through, as well as just generic cards that are always in here set. So that's that. Fighting, of course, fight and attempt to kill an enemy in your space. So again, if you happen to have a ranged weapon or you happen to have just melee weapons, again, all that fighting and tactics we'll get into. But of course, if my ghoul happened to be in the same spot as Mr. Gutsy, then I would, you know, I could choose to do a fight action to roll my dice and attempt to get 2 hits on him and take him down. So that's straightforward, and we'll talk more about that when we actually get to it. And then finally is camp. Camp's really, really important in this game because Fallout is not easy. You need to camp every once in a while as an action to recover some HP. When you recover HP, you are recovering 3 HP every single time. Of course, with my character, 12 will be my max, as we've talked about. And then you can unexhaust your companions. So any cards that you've used and that tell you have to exhaust them, you can unexhaust them, kind of like magic. They're turned sideways. And you can exchange stuff with other survivors, but guess what? We've gone into the Wasteland completely alone because we love to play games solo, and that's how it works. So that's pretty much the rundown of how to get going in Fallout, and in the next video, we are going to begin this game. Now, if I happen to forget anything in terms of the staging of this particular scenario, I'm going to cover that just before we get into the next video. So if there's anything here that I missed in terms of cards or anything like that, or any other highlights for the rules, you know, you can let me know in the comments below, and I'll make those adjustments when we start the next video. But I'll also take a quick look over to make sure everything's set up correctly and we haven't forgotten anything. But yeah, that's pretty much it. So hope to see you guys in the playthrough. Really excited about this one. Been waiting to get this to the table for quite some time, and it's finally happening. So hope you guys enjoy it, and I'll see you in the playthrough of Fallout the board game. As always, keep on rolling solo.